Christianity and Theosophy. Anti-Savanainen. Introduction. I will discuss the Christian perspectives on God, the universe, ethics, and the afterlife using Justin Brierley's book Unbelievable: Why, After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists, I'm Still a Christian. I will examine Brierley's views from the perspective of Theosophy, particularly Rosicrucian Theosophy. Brierley's book is apologetic, that is, a systematic and rational defense of Christianity. Apology means defense speech in the context of this essay. I will also consider what an apology for Theosophy might look like. Brierley is an author, speaker, and broadcaster. He hosted a British Christian radio show, Unbelievable, for several years. In his show, Christians met atheists and sometimes representatives of other religions, with each side being allowed to present their point of view. Brierley's approach to hosting the program was pleasant. He listened and responded to his guests and their opinions in a respectful and neutral manner. God and the universe. An atheist does not believe in God or anything supernatural. The material universe is all there is, except Buddhism, which is atheistic, but contains supernatural beliefs. The Christian view is metaphysical and theistic. There is an invisible reality and an omnipotent, personal God. According to Christianity, God created the universe, which means that the world has not always existed, nor did it come into being by itself. Is there any scientific evidence for this? Before the Big Bang Theory, it was thought in scientific circles that the universe had always existed. We now know with a high degree of certainty that the observable universe originated from a very hot and small initial state. Evidence of this includes, for instance, the universe's expansion and the cosmic microwave background radiation. In the Christian interpretation, God must be the origin of the universe. It will come as no surprise to the reader that physicists in general do not share this view. The second physics-related argument consists of the laws and constants of nature. They seem to be just right for life. Small changes in certain natural constants, e.g., the strength of gravity, would make the current carbon-based, life-friendly universe impossible. No known law of physics determines the magnitude of the natural constants, which could, in principle, take any value. Have we just been lucky that we happen to have the correctly matched physical parameters? Brierley presents Sir Roger Penrose's estimate that the values of the physical parameters would be just right by chance. The probability is amazingly small. Of course, a physical explanation may be found one day. One possible explanation would be a multiverse with many parallel universes. This would allow all possible combinations of values of the natural constants allowed by the laws of physics to come true. That would explain why we live in a universe that is just right for us. Many leading physicists seem to believe this explanation. The defense of the Christian faith has historically succumbed many times to appeals to the God of the gaps. Because we don't know something, it must be the work of God. This explanation has proved weak because as scientific knowledge increases, the gaps in the evidence for God seem to fill in. Brierley asks why something exists in the first place, and why it is possible to study the universe through mathematical physics. These are good questions, and there are no universally accepted answers. The Christian's answer is, of course, God, but the atheist is obviously not satisfied with this answer. Perhaps surprisingly, Theosophy provides quite a similar answer to Christianity. The world is an ordered cosmos with great wisdom behind it. Theosophy does not acknowledge a personal God, but some versions of Theosophy speak of the universal logos. Human dignity, the basis of morality and the meaning of life. Brierley reflects on human dignity and its justification. He explains that in the 1970s in Bogota, street children lived in sewers. Militants would hunt them down and kill them because the street children had no value. Killing them was compared to killing lice. A Christian, wealthy businessman, James Jaramillo, set up a home for the children and saved them from the streets and death. Brierley asks why almost everyone can see that Jaramillo did the right thing and the child killers did the wrong thing. From an atheistic worldview, it is not easy to justify why the killers did what was objectively wrong because there is, and can be, no absolute morality in the universe according to atheism. In this perspective, morality and ethics are based on agreements between human beings and the tendencies developed by evolution. Brierley points out that many atheists are committed to ethical principles despite having no objective justification for their ethics. The eminent skeptic and atheist Sam Harris has put forward an interesting counterargument. If the welfare of conscious beings is accepted as the starting point, science has much to say objectively about the problems of ethics. The reader can infer from Harris's premise that Buddhist ethics inspires him. The problem remains here too. What naturalistic principle would oblige everyone to be interested in the well-being of conscious beings? Brierley examines the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1, which states, quote, begins, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood." Quote ends. According to Brierley, the intrinsic value of human beings that emerges here can only be justified if there is a God, because God is the basis of all morality and goodness. On the other hand, the God of the Old Testament required the Amalekites to kill every last man, woman, child, and beast, which weakens the argument for a Christian God as a justification for morality. Objective morality or ethics clearly presuppose a metaphysical principle, which in Theosophy takes the form of a law of karma. Karma entails that every action, word, thought, and emotion has a consequence of its quality, which sooner or later returns to man. This is perfectly illustrated in the Buddhist Dhammapada. Quote begins, "Not in the sky, nor in the middle of the ocean, nor in the cave of a mountain, nor anywhere else, is there a place where one may escape from the consequences of an evil deed." Quote ends. However, karma does not oblige a person to act virtuously. A more profound moral justification can be found in the universal brotherhood that Theosophy strongly endorses. Human beings and all living beings are brothers and sisters with each other because we are fundamentally all one. There is an eternal spirit in the human being, the eternal self. The good must be learned to do for its own sake, not in the hope of reward, e.g., good karma, or for any other selfish reason. This is what the Christians also think, although they do not accept the notion of karma. The question of the meaning of life is intertwined with the previous reflections. From an atheistic point of view, there is no deeper meaning to life. Evolutionary biologist and leading atheist Richard Dawkins puts it starkly, quote begins, "The universe that we observe has, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." Quote ends. Of course, despite this, the atheist can find a subjective meaning for their life. Brierley suggests that for the Christian, the purpose of life is participation in the life and resurrection of Christ. This new life does not begin in the afterlife, but begins in this life. Brierley's interpretation of Christianity is quite positive from a theosophical point of view. Still, it does not clearly reflect the procedural nature of the Christian life as expressed, for instance, in the Orthodox way of striving for moral and spiritual perfection. It is believed in the Orthodox Church that the purpose of life is to grow from the image of God into the likeness of God. This requires active human effort, which Theosophy calls the path of purification. On the other hand, in the Orthodox Church, it may be thought that the journey from image to likeness can only occur within the Church. An interesting example of this is the monk Father Anton's reflection, quote begins, "I am forced to ask how our Church alone has the right faith when there is obvious observable evidence of angelic goodness in people of other religions. 2 Buddhists visited here. Gentle, humble, clean-eyed. How could infidelity or idolatry radiate such purity of spirit in its servant?" Quote ends. The recorder of Father Anton's words responded with her thoughts. That radiance is reflected across the boundaries of religions, from all faces oriented to God. This is the idea that Theosophy wants to emphasize. There is no religion higher than truth. The life and resurrection of Jesus. Brierley examines 3 non-Christian conceptions of Jesus: Jesus as a guru, Jesus as a rebel, and Jesus as a husband. Of these 3, only Jesus as a guru is interesting for this essay. Brierley briefly examines Deepak Chopra's Jesus. a story of enlightenment, in which Chopra writes about a time in Jesus' life when the Bible says nothing, that is, the lost years. Chopra interprets Jesus' life within the framework of Oriental mysticism, suggesting that Jesus achieved God consciousness and oneness with God, after which he became a spiritual teacher or guru. According to the archaeological expert quoted by Brierley, this is a New Age version of Jesus, compatible with the Gnostic image of Jesus, but very alien to the first-century Jewish culture and classical Christianity. What does Rosicrucian Theosophy, or in this case, the Finnish expert in esoteric Christianity, Pekka Urvast, say about Jesus? He does have a Gnostic interpretation from the perspective of Christianity Brierley represents. According to Urvast, Jesus was the first person in whom Christ became fully alive. He brought the cosmic Christ into the Earth's aura, close to everyone regardless of religion. The anthroposophist Rudolf Steiner had a similar view. Since then, it has been possible to reach the Christ consciousness of the higher self in the waking consciousness, whereas before it was only possible in the invisible world. The Apostle Paul made it very clear that without the resurrection of Jesus, there would be no Christianity. Brierley points out evidence that supports or is compatible with the resurrection of Jesus after his crucifixion and burial. These include the historicity of the crucifixion, the discovery of an empty tomb by Jesus' companions, women in particular, and the disciples' encounter with the risen Jesus. Brierley also considers possible explanations challenging the resurrection interpretation, e.g., Jesus' followers went to the wrong tomb. Typically, theosophical authors interpret the resurrection of Jesus allegorically, whereas in the teachings of Urvast and Steiner, the resurrection is seen as a realistic event that changed the spiritual history of humanity. Of course, the interpretation of the meaning of the resurrection by these spiritual teachers differs from classical Christianity. Heaven and hell. According to classical Christianity, believers go to heaven, and non-believers go to an eternal hell of suffering, regardless of their life or character. Brierley rejects both interpretations as unbiblical. He thinks that heaven means life in the kingdom of heaven, where Jesus is the king. By this, Brierley is obviously referring to the post-Judgment Day period, since he uses the term renewed creation to describe heaven. If I interpret Brierley correctly, this is not a post-death state of heaven. And what happens to non-believers? Brierley does not believe in hell in this sense. Instead, he believes in the annihilation of those who do not accept Jesus as their king. This is a much more merciful view than the traditional view of hell. Theosophy's position on heaven and hell is completely different from that of Brierley or classical Christianity. There is no eternal hell, and the immortal spirit in the human being cannot be destroyed. Individuality evolves from one reincarnation to another towards the perfect human being, which is called the master in Theosophy. Apology for Theosophy. What would a theosophical apology or defense speech look like? First, it would be important to look critically at which doctrines of modern Theosophy are time-bound and which truly represent eternal wisdom. Another important issue is language. The concepts of Theosophy are over 100 years old and not easily understood by modern people. This is why we need to present Theosophy in a modern language. We have several promising examples of this. In Finland, Mori Lehtovirta's The Yoga of Jesus. In the USA, Edward Abdul's The Secret Gateway. And in England, Tim Wyatt's Cycles of Eternity. The positive interpretations of reincarnation and the law of karma are very important and always relevant. Nowadays, these teachings have found their way into many people's thinking in one form or another. If reincarnation is true, many questions about human life will be answered, which is very different from the teachings of the atheist worldview and the Christian faith. I also think that the question of the afterlife is important, what really awaits people after death. An atheist would answer that nothing, and the Christian positions have already been mentioned above. Interestingly, there is scientifically collected empirical evidence on both reincarnation and the death process in terms of children's reincarnation memories and near-death experiences. These findings are, to some extent, compatible with the theosophical teachings. Theosophical knowledge of the afterlife is thought to be based on spiritual perception, which means that it represents a different kind of empirical knowledge. It is, of course, up to the reader to accept or reject this claim. Theosophy offers a worldview that sees different religions as branches of the same tree, and all people belonging to the same family, regardless of any distinguishing factors. This vision unites the world and is compatible with the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Perhaps this declaration was inspired to some extent by Theosophy. The Apology of Theosophy contains an ideal that many, regardless of their worldview, can identify as correct. Theosophy sets out a noble goal for human life: to grow in wisdom, knowledge, and compassion, to become a servant of humanity.